In the last days of 1973, Deborah Kerb was a 17-year-old student at Fresno High School. Her friends and teachers described her as a cheerful and outstanding student. On December 31, 1973, Deborah hosted a small get-together inside her family's residence located on the 4000 block of College Avenue in Fresno, California, while her parents were away in Pismo. To welcome the new year, Deborah Kerb and her friends, which included her boyfriend and another couple, engaged in puzzle solving while listening to music. When the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of the year 1974, the small party ended and the young host bid her friends farewell. Tragically, Deborah would only have a little glimpse of a potentially fruitful year. On January 1, 1974, in the late afternoon, Deborah's parents came back home to find her lying dead with her own leotard wrapped around her neck. When the tragedy was reported to the police, an investigation into the case was launched, and detectives started looking into persons who had last seen Deborah alive, specifically those who had attended her party hours earlier. A young man named James Arthur Blaylock, who was 17 years old at the time, was quickly suspected by authorities. James was one of the party attendants and had come along with his girlfriend to the gathering. He was said to have driven the others home when they left Deborah's residence. Authorities believed that James Blaylock might have committed the murder. They were of the opinion that he had gone back to the Kerb family home, using a spare key he had known the location of to get inside and rape and kill Deborah. Unfortunately, though, that was only a theory. There was no concrete proof to convict James for the crime. In 1974, due to a lack of supporting forensic equipment, detectives were unable to prove what they so firmly felt to be true: the fact that 17-year-old James Blaylock was a deadly killer. The Deborah Kerb's case, however, slowly became cold. Many years later, in 2006, the Fresno County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation and attempted to run some of the biological evidence collected from the crime scene through recently developed DNA technology. This time, there was a success. James Blaylock's DNA matched the sexual assault kit. To further confirm this, Deborah Kerb's body was also exhumed in 2006 so that a DNA sample from her could be obtained. The samples were then submitted to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit forensic lab in California that soon confirmed James Blaylock as the culprit investigators have been looking for all these years. James Blaylock, who was incarcerated at the time, was subsequently interviewed by Fresno County Sheriff's detectives Marty Rivera and Jeff Kurtzen. He denied killing Deborah and having sex with her. Blaylock soon changed his account after the detectives confronted him with a DNA match of his semen. He claimed he and Deborah had consensual sex but never killed her. The case was brought by the district attorney's office, but it had to be dropped for lack of supporting evidence. The case went cold again for another 15 years. In December 2021, Sergio Toscano, a current cold case detective and former Fresno County Sheriff's officer, revisited the Deborah Kerb's case and asked for a repeat DNA test on the leotard used to strangle Deborah. James Blaylock's DNA results were obtained again. His DNA was confirmed on the sexual assault kit and also appeared on the leotard. After this discovery, in 2023, detectives tried to get in touch with James Blaylock, but they soon learned that he had died in the hospital in 2022. He was 66 years old at the time. Blaylock had a significant criminal history over the course of his lifetime, which included violent crimes and becoming a registered sex offender.
The quiet Ohio town of Boardman was rocked by a horrifying crime early on April 4, 1972. In the Boardman Plaza neighborhood of Youngstown, Ohio, the body of a 12-year-old boy named Brad Bellino was discovered thrown in the trash can behind a dairy store. The idea that their community could experience such a tragedy astounded the locals. Since Brad had vanished on the evening of March 31, 1972, it was clear that he had met a terrible end. Who could have done this to an innocent child and why? This was the one question that was on everyone's mind as the authorities tried to make sense of the situation. Located in Ohio's Mahoning County, Boardman is a thriving community. With a populace exceeding 40,000, it holds the position of the second largest municipality within the Youngstown-Warren metropolitan area. Boardman is a center of business activity, home to a variety of eateries, retail establishments and companies serving the local populace. The township, which dates back to the early 1800s, is home to a number of interesting landmarks, including the Southern Park Mall and Boardman Park. Based on statistical data, the crime rate in Boardman is 2.23 per 1,000 residents over the course of a typical year. It is in this city that our story today took place. Bradley Bellino, son of Joseph and Elisa Bellino, was born on April 7, 1959. He was the fourth kid they had. Brad's parents welcomed him into the world with great joy, and he soon won their hearts. Brad was the youngest member of the family, living alongside his two older brothers and older sister. Don Templeman, Brad's closest friend, recalled him as a young child who was constantly seeking out the next adventure. He was open to trying anything new and had a voracious appetite for information. He was an extrovert. Although we both liked to take risks, it was he who suggested the risk, and I was the one who accepted it, Don Templeman remarked. Don and Brad were best friends for life. They were always open to taking on new challenges and had a constant love of adventure. Although it's unclear when they became best friends, it's likely that Boardman Center Middle School is where they first became acquainted. The two boys were regular bike riders in the town. They occasionally hitched rides as well, Brad being the more daring of the two. There was a rock and gem store not far from Brad's house. The two boys frequented the shop often because they were fascinated by rocks and enjoyed studying them. Their mutual love of baseball bonded them even more. When we started playing baseball together, I was the pitcher, and he was the catcher, and my dad was the coach, Don recalled in an interview. The two boys started spending nights at each other's houses on a regular basis over time. Being only 3 miles apart made it easy for Brad and his friend to hang out whenever they wanted. On Friday evenings, Don would usually go to Brad's house and then walk together to the nearby movie theater. They alternated Saturdays, with the boys staying the night at Applewood Acres at Don's house. They would converse and play games for hours on end, long into the night. I was more naive, and he was more worldly, I think, because of his older brothers. He would educate me on aspects of life I was unaware of, Don remarked. They would go to church with Don's family on Sunday mornings. Don's mom would usually offer Brad a ride home afterward. These weekends held unadulterated joy and camaraderie for Don and Brad. The two friends were fully enjoying life, taking advantage of their youth and all the adventures it had to offer. But then something unexpected happened that would completely alter the situation. Over the Easter break on Friday, March 31, 1972, 11-year-old Don and 12-year-old Brad spent the day together. The two boys went on their customary adventures and wandered the town that Friday. But when they realized a brown van was following them everywhere they went, what had started out as a fun day quickly took a worrying turn. They dismissed it at first as a coincidence, but when they saw the van for the fourth time, their good humor turned to panic. Aware of possible danger, they made the decision to return to Don's home. Returning home also seemed prudent, especially since the sun had begun to set. After arriving at Don's home on Teakwood Drive, Brad grabbed his phone and called his brother to let him know he would be spending the night. But just as Brad was getting comfortable for what should have been a fun evening, the phone rang. The caller was his father, Joseph, who insisted on his going back home right away. Brad had to tell Don he had to leave and return home after receiving this unexpected call. Brad was unable to get a ride home from Don's mother, who was at the grocery store at the time. He was forced to return home alone because Don's father was confined to bed due to the flu. Brad bid his friend farewell and left the house at 7:30 p.m. It never occurred to Don that that would be his last encounter with his closest friend. Reported events following this are not entirely consistent. What is known, though, is that when Brad's father, Joseph, came home late that evening, he had no idea his son had gone missing. It was his assumption that Brad had returned safely from his friend's house and was sound asleep inside. However, Brad's mother, Elisa, was completely oblivious to the events taking place at home that fateful day, as she worked in Cleveland. On the Saturday that followed, Joseph slept until noon. But as soon as he got up and started to go about the house, he knew something wasn't right. Brad was not in the house. Concerned, he called the Templeman's house. It didn't take him long to find out that Brad had left their home the previous evening at 7:30 p.m. He ended the call and started looking for Brad around the neighborhood, but he was unable to find him. He reported his son missing to the Boardman Police Department out of desperation. Concern was raised when word of Brad's disappearance quickly spread throughout the small town. Local newspapers joined the search after the news eventually attracted the attention of the media. In the hopes that someone would recognize the missing boy, they published a thorough description of him. According to the description, Brad weighed 80 pounds and was 4'8" inches tall. His short blonde hair fell just below his ears, and his blue eyes were his most striking features. He was wearing blue jeans, a blue ski jacket, and white tennis shoes with black stripes when he vanished. Tony D. Appolito, Brad's first cousin and a Youngstown police officer at the time, joined the search efforts in Boardman after hearing of Brad's disappearance. He was reported missing, and we took to the streets, Tony said. In spite of the community's and the police's best efforts, Brad appeared to have simply disappeared. His absence created a deep hole in the hearts of his friends and family. 4 days after Brad went missing, on April 4, 1972, a body was discovered. A certain sanitation worker by the name of Paul Smith was doing his usual pickup of trash. Something caught his eye as he got closer to a dumpster behind Izali's dairy store. Since the dumpster was only halfway filled, a pair of sneakers protruding at an odd angle caught his attention. When he looked more closely, he was horrified to find a small boy's body hidden under cardboard boxes and abandoned store items. Paul saw that the boy's head was hung down and that a belt was securely fastened around his neck. He had his pants down below his hips, undone. Paul called the police right away to report what he had discovered. Don's house was about 2 miles down the road from this grim discovery. There was a great sense of dread upon the Boardman police officers' arrival at the scene. When they looked inside the dumpster and saw the body inside, it looked like the missing boy they had been looking for non-stop. However, they required verification. They got in touch with Tony, Brad's cousin, who had been helping with the search, and asked him to identify the body. Tony raced to the scene and, despite his sorrow, he was able to identify Brad, his cousin, as the body in the dumpster. After this confirmation, the body was taken out of the dumpster and brought to Youngstown's Southside Hospital for an autopsy. Tony, in the meantime, was given the duty of informing Brad's parents of the tragic news. "It was terrible for my aunt, Elisa, and the whole family," Tony recalled. "You can never move past that. You never think something like this could happen to you or a member of your family, even though you hear about it." He continued. Before the start of the new school week, Don spent the weekend looking for Brad after he vanished. Don had heard his math teacher talking to other teachers in the hallway on the Tuesday that Brad's body was discovered. Don claims that after returning to the classroom, his teacher declared that Brad had been found. Don remembered the whole class cheering and bouncing up and down in joy. His teacher then added the devastating comment, "But he's dead." Don said that the next hour was still a blur in his memory. He did not know if he had fainted, but the next thing he could recall was asking to be sent home at the school office. The autopsy results were released to the public as Brad's bereaved family and friends struggled to process the shock of his untimely death. According to the coroner's report, Brad's body had been violated and he had been strangled to death. Additionally, the report stated that Brad had died at 9 p.m. on Saturday, April 1st, over 24 hours after his last known location. The heartbreak and despair felt by Brad's loved ones were worsened by these upsetting details from the report. Following this, an inquiry was launched to identify the culprit. There was still a lot of unanswered questions. What happened to Brad between Friday at 7:30 p.m. and Saturday at 9 p.m. if the coroner's report was accurate? There was a 26-hour gap that remained unexplained, raising the unsettling possibility that Brad was kept in an unidentified location, or that there was another crime scene in addition to the dumpster. The last time Brad was seen was another question. According to early newspaper reports, he was spotted playing basketball on Saturday afternoon at the Southern Park Mall, the Dairy Queen near North Lima, and the area around Don's house on Matthews Road. Later reports, however, raised doubts about these sightings, speculating that witnesses may have really seen Brad on Friday at those locations. Since it was a holiday and there was no school, it was probably easy for people to mix up the days, which led to this confusion. Don would subsequently claim that it was impossible for Brad to have been seen on Saturday. Don disclosed that he and his father were brought to the station by the police as part of the investigation. There, the detectives showed him Brad's outfit and inquired as to whether it matched what Brad had on when he left Don's house. Don attested to the fact that at that point, they showed Don the belt that had been found around Brad's neck and asked if it belonged to Brad. Don verified that it indeed did. Don found it impossible to shake the image of the brown van they had seen the day Brad vanished. He thought that his best friend's untimely death had something to do with this strange car. "I think whoever was in that van waited until he was in a dark spot and took him," Don said. Police subsequently stated that hundreds of cars, including an orange Corvette, had been reported to them on multiple occasions, with Brad's murder being connected to them. None of these suggestions, though, produced any significant leads. The community came together for Brad's funeral as the investigation into his murder proceeded. Don was one of the guests at the crowd-filled event where standing room was scarce. Almost every student from the school, along with their parents, and even the teachers from the town, came for Brad's funeral. Don's once blissful childhood came to an abrupt end after this tragic event, and his life took on an entirely new and difficult shape. "I was very much more cautious. You believed that everyone was trying to harm you. I became very paranoid," Don remarked. 2 months after Brad's untimely death, in June 1972, Don's parents made the decision to move from Boardman to Tennessee. They were keen to get their family away from a town they felt was unsafe for their kids, and one that had too many painful memories. Don's mother was plagued by guilt for a very long time. She held herself responsible for not being there to drive Brad home the night he vanished. The investigation into Brad's death didn't seem to be moving forward much over time. Months turned into years, and the detectives working on the case kept running into roadblocks despite pursuing numerous leads and interrogating numerous suspects. The case got colder every day, and Brad's chances of winning justice grew smaller. In the year 2001, Jeffrey Patterson, a Boardman former police chief, didn't let Brad's case go unsolved. He made the decision to resume the inquiry into his case. After being dispatched to the cemetery where Brad was buried, detectives meticulously dug up his body in order to collect DNA evidence. Chief Jeffrey took an important action by sending Brad's clothing, which had been kept as evidence, to the state's Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. A startling discovery was made by forensic scientists during the examination. They discovered a DNA that wasn't Brad's. The investigation gained new hope from this discovery. 2 detectives, Jack Nichols and Robert Roop, were given the case as a new assignment in 2007 by Jeffrey, the former chief of police. Nichols was only 14 years old when the terrible event happened back in 1972, and he had grown up in the same neighborhood where Brad went missing. He had been thinking about the case for years, and now he could finally pursue justice in Brad's honor. As soon as the case was given to Nichols and Rupp, they went to work. Their first assignment was to sort through a ton of documents and multiple boxes full of jumbled evidence. Though it was an overwhelming task, they were committed to sorting everything out. As they went through the files, they noticed that 7 people's names kept coming up. These 7 people were designated as persons of interest. Despite the lack of hard evidence linking them to the crime, Nichols and Rupp remained persistent. They got search warrants quickly and got to work. During the search warrants, they collected DNA samples from each of the persons of interest. After that, these samples were sent to the lab for examination in the hopes of matching the DNA found on Brad's clothes. Unfortunately, the negative lab results crushed their hopes. No match was found. The detectives were back to the beginning after this setback. However, they never stopped carefully going through the case files in an effort to find any fresh leads. Sadly, in spite of their unwavering efforts, they were unsuccessful. "We had a lot of guesses and speculations, but no solid information," Nichols stated. Detectives Nichols and Rupp retired in 2017 after years of dedicated work on the case, and a new team took over the investigation. Albert Kakasik, a highly experienced police captain from Boardman, was in charge of this new team. In 2018, in order to help analyze the DNA found on Brad's clothing, Boardman police detectives turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology company. As technology advanced, it opened up new possibilities for solving cases like Brad's. According to the criminal profile Parabon gave the Boardman police, they were probably looking for a man of European descent with fair or very fair skin, freckles, brown or hazel eyes, and black or brown hair. The list of possible suspects was then reduced by Parabon using familial DNA to identify a group of people who had similar family histories or physical traits. Detectives collected DNA samples from individuals identified by Parabon as potentially having familial ties to the unidentified suspect over the course of the next 4 years. They worked non-stop. They were able to narrow down their search to certain branches of the extended family tree and rule out others thanks to the results of those DNA tests. In the end, with the help of a DNA test, they narrowed in on a man known as Joseph Norman Hill. Investigators searched far and wide for Hill's relatives in order to collect DNA samples for analysis. In the end, the findings showed a 98.2% chance that the DNA on Brad's clothes belonged to Hill. At last, the investigators had solved the case and found the guilty party. But there was a major setback. The man identified by DNA testing, Joseph Norman Hill, was no longer alive. He was 79 years old when he lost his fight with cancer in 2019, and to make matters more difficult, his body had been cremated. Detectives were unable to confirm his involvement with additional tests on his remains due to this regrettable turn of events. There was little easily accessible information about Joseph Norman Hill's life when the investigators dug into his life. Their investigation was limited by the fact that his wife had died in 1993 and he had few family ties. But their investigation found that Hill, who lived on Shady Side Drive in Boardman, was 32 years old at the time of Brad's murder. He moved to California in 1978 for work-related reasons while working as a truck driver for a company that sold bottled water. There was no known connection between Brad's family and Hill. Hill's sole run-in with the law dates back to his conviction in 1986 for soliciting inappropriate behavior and disorderly conduct in Los Angeles. It took a total of slightly more than $29,000 to solve Brad's case after years of searching for DNA evidence. Nevertheless, the boy's family was able to find closure, so it was worth the expense. Authorities eventually came to the conclusion that they would have felt very confident in front of a grand jury in the event that Hill had been alive, and this would have led to an indictment. According to Boardman Police Chief Todd Worth, who made this announcement during a press conference on January 24, 2023, Brad's family had decided not to issue any public statements. In order to process the new information and carry on with their healing process, They asked for privacy. They were going through a difficult time, and the last thing they needed was media attention. However, the tale is not over yet. Hill was shockingly connected in June 2023 to the 1975 death of another young boy. A mile or so from the Bellino home, 13-year-old David Evans, a Boardman resident as well, vanished 3 years after Brad was kidnapped and killed. Evans' father notified the police that he had been absent for the majority of the evening, and at midnight on January 18, 1975, Evans was listed as missing. Evans, who had been absent for over 6 hours, had diabetes. Sadly, 4 days later, he was found dead and frozen on his back in the backyard of a house on Crestline Place in Boardman. According to the autopsy, Evans had a puncture wound on his lower back and fractures to his left forearm bones. These wounds had been caused following his passing. The report also mentioned several abrasions on his upper back and face. A profile found on Evans's underwear matched Hill's DNA after multiple DNA tests were done on his clothing, which were preserved by the police, proving his connection to this second murder. The fact that Brad's murder and Evans' murder have been solved after more than 50 years demonstrates the commitment and tenacity of law enforcement personnel, as well as the remarkable developments in DNA technology. Even though the offender will never face justice in a court of law, the community and the families of the victims benefit greatly from knowing who he is.
In June 1980, Holly Ann Campiglia, a native of New Jersey, vanished following a period of poor mental health. Holly had been battling with mental issues since high school, but she became increasingly erratic when she got to college. One fateful day, on her way to a counseling appointment, she jumped out of her mother's car and was never seen again. All her family knew at the time was that she hitchhiked to Sacramento. After sending her family one letter, Holly stopped contacting them. Immediately after her disappearance, her parents, Augustine and Sally Campiglia, reported her missing, but unknowingly to them, her name was accidentally removed from the National Missing Persons Database. Meanwhile, in August 1980, the body of a 21-year-old woman was discovered in a cornfield off Seavers Road in Dixon, not far from the location of the current Pedrick produce market. She was dressed in a green wool sweater despite the summer heat and had been shot in the head numerous times. Detectives at the time had no idea that the woman's name had unintentionally been erased from the National Missing People database just 2 weeks prior. The victim and her murderer could not be identified, and so she was dubbed Dixon Jane Doe for 12 years. In 1992, when Augustine and Sally Campiglia got to know that their daughter, Holly Ann Campiglia, had accidentally dropped from the missing persons database used by law enforcement, they contacted the officials to re-add her name into the database. 5 weeks later, the Campiglias were informed by Solano County detectives that they had a match. Holly Ann was their Dixon Jane Doe. This was heartbreaking news for Holly's family. In an interview, her mother, Sally, sadly said, "I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren, but with each year, I'd lose a little hope." Even though Holly Ann could now be laid to rest properly, neither her family nor the police knew what had happened to her. The investigation was abandoned until 2021, when Holly Ann's relatives contacted the police to inquire about the possibility of using modern forensic methods to identify Holly Ann's killer. Investigators got to work, and a male's DNA was found after evidence samples at the crime scene were sent for testing. In 2023, investigators from the Solano County Sheriff's Office declared that they think the DNA belongs to Herman Lee Hobbs, who is currently 76 years old and serving a sentence at a prison in Chowchilla. According to research, Herman Lee Hobbs had been a violent criminal throughout his adult life. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, he was accused of carrying out more than a dozen armed robberies across the Sacramento region. Hobbs admitted to being the serial robber and consented to plead guilty after leading police on a wild car chase. However, when it was time for his sentence, the 6'5" mechanic attempted to flee the courthouse and had to be tackled and subdued by a CHP officer. Herman Lee Hobbs's time behind bars for armed robbery was brief. He was back on the streets by 1975. He relocated to Rio Linda, a street away from Terry Pata, a 13-year-old junior high school student. One day in January 1975, Terry Pata was sent home from school early due to her having nausea and a headache. She, however, never made it home. 9 days later, her body was discovered nearby, placed inside a drain pipe. She had been raped and fatally stabbed. At the time, no suspect was ever found. Years of sexual assault by Herman Lee Hobbs weren't made public until 2000. He was convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County that year. When Hobbs was taken into prison, his niece and daughter came forward to express concerns that he might be responsible for the deaths of numerous children. This tip led investigators to Terry Pata's long-suppressed murder. When DNA from Terry Pata's crime scene was examined, it matched Hobbs. Hobbs, who was already serving a lengthy jail sentence for rape, pled not guilty to Terry Pata's murder and was given a further 25 years to life sentence. This was just the start. That same year, some loggers discovered a woman's skull in the Yuba County foothills. Through DNA testing, the remains were identified as 29 years old Brenda Ann Tucker, who vanished from her house in the area of Oroville in 1994. Hobbs was known to Brenda Tucker's loved ones. In the 1990s, he had occasionally even stayed at their home. Hobbs was accused of killing Tucker, but a court eventually dropped the charges in 2002 owing to a lack of proof. In 2023, after his DNA was a match to the DNA at Holly Ann Campilia's crime scene, Solano County investigators had Hobbs moved to the Justice Center detention facility in Fairfield. He is being charged with first-degree murder. According to the Solano County Sheriff's Office, investigators are collaborating with other organizations in Northern California to find any additional potential victims of Herman Lee Hobbs.
On April 19, 1991, around 1 in the afternoon, David Hibbs arrived at his house eager to tell his mother, Joy Hibbs, that he had made the honor roll on his report card. Unfortunately, instead of finding his family house in Corydon, Pennsylvania the way he had left it, he returned to find it in a smoke-filled state. David ran to the back kitchen door after noticing that his mother's car was in the driveway, but heavy smoke stopped him from going through. David somehow managed to observe that the 4 gas stove burners were all lit up. At his young age, the only logical reason to what must have caused the fire was that his mother had been cooking and had forgotten to put out the fire. A helpless David yelled for assistance in panic. He was heard by neighbors doing yard work, and they tried to go in to find Joy Hibbs, but the fire was too fierce. They immediately called the firefighters. Before the firefighters arrived, as the fire increased and burned endlessly, the neighbors tried to put it out with a garden hose. After what seemed like a lifetime, the fire was finally put out by the firefighters, and a paramedic sadly informed 10-year-old David that his mother had passed away. The body of 36-year-old Joy Hibbs was found by the firefighters in David's bedroom. She had been burnt beyond recognition on the remains of David's mattress. Initially, detectives thought Joy Hibbs had perished in an accidental fire, but an autopsy revealed otherwise. There was no indication that Joy had inhaled smoke, thus it was obvious that she had already passed away before the fire was started. Also, Joy Hibbs had been brutally assaulted, strangled with wire cords, and then stabbed 5 times in the chest and neck before her attacker purposefully started the fire to hide every iota of evidence at the scene. This was a clever cover-up approach by the killer, given that the house had been completely destroyed from the fire, and that the neighbors had destroyed important evidence while attempting to put out the fire. According to the findings of the fire marshal's investigation, the fire originated from 4 different locations in the home: 2 in the kitchen, 1 in David's bedroom, and 1 in the corridor. According to the investigators, the morning of her death, Joy had cashed her paycheck. Her purse's contents were tossed on the living room floor, and the police found her wallet stuffed under the couch. The absence of evidence was compounded by the difficulty the investigators experienced in determining a motive. Joy was adored by all, worked part-time as a medical assistant, and was committed to her family. David Hibbs described his mother as graceful, polite, and easygoing. Authorities had no leads whatsoever as to the person who would want to kill her. On the day she was killed, Joy had dropped her 2 kids off at school in the morning. She received her paycheck, ran a few errands, and got home shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning. A church pastor and another member of the congregation dropped by for a visit shortly after she returned home. Joy Hibbs had indicated a desire to celebrate Easter in the church. Just before noon, the pastor and a member of the church departed the Hibbs family house. According to eyewitnesses, there was a dark blue Monte Carlo parked across the Hibbs yard shortly after the church pastor and his member left. The car was said to have remained there until 1 p.m. 2 days after Joy Hibbs' murder, former Bristol County Police Chief Tommy Mills, who was also a narcotics detective, reached out to the residence of Robert Francis Atkins in Falls, Pennsylvania. Robert lived about 2 hours away from where Joy Hibbs lived. Joy and her husband would occasionally buy tiny amounts of marijuana from Robert Atkins, who also appeared to have been their former neighbor. Robert resisted letting the detectives into his house. In the driveway, Detective Tommy Mills spotted a dark-colored Monte Carlo that matched a witness's description of a similar vehicle parked carelessly outside Joy's house shortly before the neighborhood heard the fire. However, during further investigation, the witness said Robert Atkins' automobile wasn't the one they saw. Robert Atkins was invited to undergo a polygraph by the investigators, but he refused, explaining that he had damaged his arm and that his lawyer had instructed him to wait since the nerve damage would affect the polygraph results. He further disclosed that he was camping at the Poconos with his family, friends, and co-workers when Joy's murder took place. Detectives soon verified his alibi. Robert confirmed that he bought a little marijuana for the Hibbs, but he wasn't a dealer. In the weeks preceding his mother's murder, David Hibbs overheard her arguing with Robert Atkins on the phone over the most recent purchase of a baggie of marijuana. Because the baggie was packed with stems and seeds, Joy demanded her money back from Robert. When asked by the police, Robert confirmed these arguments. He, however, stated that he had informed Joy that he couldn't refund her the money. According to him, it was simply improper. Investigators couldn't understand how a few tiny baggies of marijuana could cause someone to die. The couple was only spending $20 to $40 on marijuana at a time, not enough to get the attention of major sellers. On April 27, 1991, a co-worker of April Atkins, the wife of Robert Atkins, came forward to say that on the day Joy Hibbs was murdered, she had called the Atkins residence between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m., and Robert Atkins had picked up the call. On hearing this, the police now thought Joy's murder took place between 11:50 and 12:50. The police turned their attention to Joy's private life after determining that Robert Atkins' alibi appeared to be flawless. They questioned Joy's relatives and friends and found nothing unusual. Except for the person who had killed Joy, no one seemed to harbor any wicked intentions for her. Robert Atkins was still a person of interest in the case, despite having an alibi, though. 23 years after Joy was brutally murdered, a new Bristol Township detective, Michael Slaughter, was assigned the cold case in April 2014. Detective Slaughter made the decision to visit April Atkins, who claimed that she had never been questioned by authorities regarding the death of Joy Hibbs. She, however, clung to the narrative that her family was on vacation in the Poconos that weekend and hadn't learned of Joy's murder until they returned. A few days later, Detective Slaughter re-interrogated Robert Atkins regarding his movements at the time of Joy's death. He supported his wife's account of going camping and revealed to Slaughter that he had been a secret narcotics informant in 1991, doing drug deals and then reporting them to the police. During an interview with Slaughter in May 2014, a co-worker of Joy claimed that on the Monday before she was killed, a man called Joy at work and threatened to kill her. The co-worker decided not to report the call to the police because Joy's husband was now the focus of the investigation at the time. 2 years later, in September 2016, April Atkins, who is now divorced, traveled to the Bristol Township Police Station in order to provide a taped statement regarding her ex-husband's whereabouts during the murder of Joy Hibbs. Detective Slaughter was informed by April that Robert Atkins had returned home covered in blood after allegedly stabbing someone and setting their home on fire. He then instructed her to gather the children, take a few days off work, and travel to the Poconos in the north. Out of anxiety and fear, April remained silent. That day, Robert Atkins took a shower after washing his blood-stained clothing. April Atkins didn't find out about Joy Hibbs's murder until after the family had returned from the Poconos. Even with this revelation, nothing significant occurred in Joy Hibbs' case for the next 5 years until November 2021, when Bucks County Detective David Hanks located a former co-worker of April Atkins back in 1991. The co-worker initially denied knowing April, but after the DA subpoenaed her to testify before a grand jury over the phone call she had made to the Atkins house, she changed her story. When he was supposed to be camping at the Poconos, Robert Atkins answered the phone call. The following month, Detective Hanks caught a conversation between Robert Atkins and his ex-wife, April, on tape. Robert was led to believe that April had informed her roommate of his involvement in the murder of Joy Hibbs. Naturally, this raised Robert Atkins' blood pressure. Also, his son testified in court in April 2022 that his father had informed him in December that he was likely going to be arrested soon for something that had occurred many years earlier. Robert first mentioned that a woman had died in a fire to his son before mentioning that she had been stabbed. Finally, 31 years after killing Joy Hibbs, Robert Atkins was arrested in May 2022. He is presently being held at the Bucks County Correctional Facility and faces charges of first and second-degree murder, 7 counts of arson, 2 counts of robbery, and 7 counts of first-degree arson in relation to the death of Joy Hibbs.